Valley of Dreams by Stanley Weinbaum. Chapter 1. Captain Harrison of the Ares expedition turned away from the little telescope in the bow of the rocket. 2 weeks more, at the most, he remarked. Mars only retrogrades for 70 days in all, relative to the Earth, and we've got to be homeward bound during that period, or wait a year and a half for old Mother Earth to go around the sun and catch up with us again. How do you like to spend a winter here? Dick Jarvis, chemist of the party, shivered as he looked up from his notebook. I'd just as soon spend it in a liquid air tank, he averred. These 80 below zero summer nights are plenty for me. Well, mused the captain, the first successful Martian expedition ought to be home long before then. Successful, if we get home, corrected Jarvis. I don't trust these cranky rockets, not since the auxiliary dumped me in the middle of Thiel last week. Walking back from a rocket ride is a new sensation to me. Which reminds me, returned Harrison, that we've got to recover your films. They're important if we're to pull this trip out of the red. Remember how the public mobbed the first moon pictures? Our shots ought to pack 'em to the doors. And the broadcast rights, too. We might show a profit for the Academy. What interests me, countered Jarvis, is a personal profit. A book, for instance. Exploration books are always popular. Martian Deserts. How's that for a title? Lousy, grunted the captain. Sounds like a cookbook for desserts. You'd have to call it Love Life of a Martian or something like that. Jarvis chuckled. Anyway, he said, if we once get back home, I'm going to grab what profit there is and never, never get any farther from the Earth than a good stratosphere plane will take me. I've learned to appreciate the planet after plowing over this dried-up hill we're on now. I'll lay you odds you'll be back here year after next, grinned the captain. You'll want to visit your pal, that trick ostrich. Tweel, the other's tone sobered. I wish I hadn't lost him at that. He was a good scout. I'd never have survived the Dream Beast but for him. And that battle with the pushcart things. I never even had a chance to thank him. A pair of lunatics, you two, observed Harrison. He squinted through the port at the grey gloom of the Mare Chimerium. There comes the sun. He paused. Listen, Dick. You and Leroy take the other auxiliary rocket and go out and salvage those films. Jarvis stared. Me and Leroy, he echoed ungrammatically. Why not me and Putz? An engineer would have some chance of getting us there and back if the rocket goes bad on us. The captain nodded toward the stern, whence issued at that moment a medley of blows and guttural expletives. Putz is going over the insides of the Ares, he announced. He'll have his hands full until we leave, because I want every bolt inspected. It's too late for repairs once we cast off. And if Leroy and I crack up, that's our last auxiliary. Pick up another ostrich and walk back, suggested Harrison gruffly. Then he smiled. If you have trouble, we'll hunt you out in the Ares, he finished. Those films are important. He turned. Leroy. The dapper little biologist appeared, his face questioning. You and Jarvis are off to salvage the auxiliary, the captain said. Everything's ready, and you'd better start now. Call back at half-hour intervals. I'll be listening. Leroy's eyes glistened. Perhaps we land for specimens, no? He queried. Land if you want to. This golf ball seems safe enough. Except for the Dream Beast, muttered Jarvis with a faint shudder. He frowned suddenly. Say, as long as we're going that way, suppose I have a look for Tweel's home. He must live off there somewhere, and he's the most important thing we've seen on Mars. Harrison hesitated. If I thought you could keep out of trouble, he muttered. All right, he decided. Have a look. There's food and water aboard the auxiliary. You can take a couple of days. But keep in touch with me, you saps. Jarvis and Leroy went through the airlock out into the gray plain. The thin air, still scarcely warmed by the rising sun, bit flesh and lung like needles, and they gasped with a sense of suffocation. They dropped to a sitting posture, waiting for their bodies, trained by months in acclimatization chambers back on Earth, to accommodate themselves to the tenuous air. Leroy's face, as always, turned a smothered blue, and Jarvis heard his own breath rasping and rattling in his throat. But in 5 minutes the discomfort passed. They rose and entered the little auxiliary rocket that rested beside the black hull of the Ares. The underjets roared out their fiery atomic blast. Dirt and bits of shattered biopods spun away in a cloud as the rocket rose. Harrison watched the projectile trail its flaming way into the south, then turned back to his work. It was 4 days before he saw the rocket again. Just at evening, as the sun dropped behind the horizon, with the suddenness of a candle falling into the sea, the auxiliary flashed out of the southern heavens, easing gently down on the flaming wings of the underjets. Jarvis and Leroy emerged, passed through the swiftly gathering dusk, and faced him in the light of the Ares. He surveyed the two. Jarvis was tattered and scratched, but apparently in better condition than Leroy, whose dapperness was completely lost. The little biologist was pale as the nearer moon that glowed outside. One arm was bandaged in thermoskin, and his clothes hung in veritable rags, but it was his eyes that struck Harrison most strangely. To one who lived these many weary days with the diminutive Frenchman, there was something queer about them. They were frightened, plainly enough, and that was odd, since Leroy was no coward, or he'd never have been one of the 4 chosen by the Academy for the first Martian expedition. But the fear in his eyes was more understandable than that other expression, that queer fixity of gaze, like one in a trance, or like a person in an ecstasy. Like a chap who's seen heaven and hell together. Harrison expressed it to himself. He was yet to discover how right he was. He assumed a gruffness as the wary pair sat down. "You're a fine-looking couple," he growled. "I should have known better than to let you wander off alone." He paused. "Is your arm all right, Leroy? Need any treatment?" Jarvis answered, "It's all right, just gashed. No danger of infection here, I guess. Leroy says there aren't any microbes on Mars." "Well," exploded the captain, "let's hear it then. Your radio reports sounded screwy. Escaped from paradise, huh?" "I didn't want to give details on the radio," said Jarvis soberly. "You'd have thought we'd gone loony." "I think so anyway." "Moi aussi," muttered Leroy. "I too." "Shall I begin at the beginning?" queried the chemist. "Our early reports were pretty nearly complete." He stared at Putz, who had come in silently, his face and hands blackened with carbon, and seated himself beside Harrison. "At the beginning," the captain decided. "Well," began Jarvis, "we got started all right, and flew due south along the meridian of the Ares, same course I'd followed last week. I was getting used to this narrow horizon, so I didn't feel so much like being cooped under a big bowl, but one does keep overestimating distances. Something 4 miles away looks 8 when you're used to terrestrial curvature, and that makes you guess its size just 4 times too large. A little hill looks like a mountain until you're almost over it." "I know that," grunted Harrison. "Yes, but Leroy didn't, and I spent our first couple of hours trying to explain it to him. By the time he understood, if he does yet, we were past Chimerium and over that Xanthus desert, and then we crossed the canal with the mud city and the barrel-shaped citizens, and the place where Tweel had shot the dream beast. And nothing would do for Pierre here but that we put down so he could practice his biology on the remains. So we did. The thing was still there, no sign of decay. Couldn't be, of course, without bacterial forms of life, and Leroy says that Mars is as sterile as an operating table." cum le cordon felus, corrected the little biologist, who was beginning to regain a trace of his usual energy. Like an old maid's heart. However, resumed Jarvis, about 100 of the little gray-green biopods had fastened onto the thing and were growing and branching. Leroy found a stick and knocked him off, and each branch broke away and became a biopod crawling around with the others. So he poked around at the creature while I looked away from it. Even dead, that rope-armed devil gave me the creeps. And then came the surprise. The thing was part plant. "C'est vrai," confirmed the biologist. "It's true." "It was a big cousin of the biopods," continued Jarvis. "Leroy was quite excited. He figures that all Martian life is of that sort, neither plant nor animal. Life here never differentiated, he says. Everything has both natures in it, even the barrel creatures, even Tweel. I think he's right, especially when I recall how Tweel rested, sticking his beak in the ground and staying that way all night. I never saw him eat or drink either. Perhaps his beak was more in the nature of a root, and he got his nourishment that way." "Sounds nutty to me," observed Harrison. "Well," continued Jarvis, "we broke up a few of the other growths, and they acted the same way. The pieces crawled around, only much slower than the biopods, and then stuck themselves in the ground. Then Leroy had to catch a sample of the walking grass, and we were ready to leave when a parade of the barrel creatures rushed by with their pushcarts. They hadn't forgotten me either. They all drummed out, 'We are friends! Ouch!' just as they had before. Leroy wanted to shoot one and cut it up, but I remembered the battle Tweel and I had with them, and vetoed the idea. But he did hit on a possible explanation as to what they did with all the rubbish they gathered." "Made mud pies, I guess," grunted the captain. "More or less," agreed Jarvis. "They use it for food, Leroy thinks. If they're part vegetable, you see, that's what they'd want. Soil with organic remains in it to make it fertile. That's why they'd ground up sand and biopods and other growths all together. See?" "Dimly," countered Harrison. "How about the suicides?" Leroy had a hunch there, too. The suicides jump into the grinder when the mixture has too much sand and gravel. They throw themselves in to adjust the proportions. "Rats," said Harrison disgustedly. "Why couldn't they bring in some extra branches from outside?" "Because suicide is easier. You've got to remember that these creatures can't be judged by earthly standards. They probably don't feel pain, and they haven't got what we'd call individuality. Any intelligence they have is the property of the whole community, like an ant heap. That's it. Ants are willing to die for their anthill. So are these creatures." "So are men," observed the captain, "if it comes to that." "Yes, but men aren't exactly eager. It takes some emotion, like patriotism, to work 'em to the point of dying for their country. These things do it all in a day's work." He paused. "Well, we took some pictures of the dream beast and the barrel creatures, and then we started along. We sailed over Xanthus, keeping as close to the meridian of the Ares as we could, and pretty soon we crossed the trail of the pyramid builder. So we circled back to let Leroy take a look at it, and when we found it, we landed. The thing had completed just 2 rows of bricks since Tweel and I left it, and there it was, breathing in silicon and breathing out bricks as if it had eternity to do it in, which it has. Leroy wanted to dissect it with a Boland explosive bullet, but I thought that anything that had lived for 10 million years was entitled to the respect due to old age, so I talked him out of it. He peeped into the hole on top of it and nearly got beamed by the arm coming up with the brick, and then he chipped off a few pieces of it, which didn't disturb the creature a bit. He found the place had it chipped, tried to see if there was any sign of healing, and decided he could tell better in 2,000 or 3,000 years. So we took a few shots of it and sailed on. Mid-afternoon, we located the wreck of my rocket. Not a thing disturbed. We picked up my films and tried to decide what next. I wanted to find Tweel, if possible. I figured from the fact of his pointing south that he lived somewhere near Thiel. We plotted our route and judged that the desert we were in now was Thiel 2. Thiel 1 should be east of us. So, on a hunch, we decided to have a look at Thiel 1, and away we buzzed.
"Der motors?"
queried Potts, breaking his long silence. For a wonder, we had no trouble, Carl. Your blast worked perfectly. So we hummed along pretty high to get a wider view. I'd say about 50,000 feet. Thiel 2 spread out like an orange carpet, and after a while we came to the gray branch of the Mare Cronium that bounded it. That was narrow. We crossed it in half an hour, and there was Thiel 1, same orange-hued desert as its mate. We veered south toward the Mare Australe and followed the edge of the desert, and toward sunset we spotted it.
"Spotted?"
Echoed Potts.
"What was spotted?"
The desert was spotted with buildings. Not one of the mud cities of the canals, although a canal went through it. From the map, we figured the canal was a continuation of the one Schiaparelli called Ascanius. We were probably too high to be visible to any inhabitants of the city, but also too high for a good look at it, even with the glasses. However, it was nearly sunset anyway, so we didn't plan on dropping in. We circled the place. The canal went out into the Mare Australe, and there, glittering in the south, was the melting polar ice cap. The canal drained it. We could distinguish the sparkle of water in it. Off to the southeast, just at the edge of the Mare Australe, was a valley, the first irregularity I'd seen on Mars, except the cliffs that bounded Xanthus and Thiel 2. We flew over the valley. Jarvis paused suddenly and shuddered. Leroy, whose color had begun to return, seemed to pale. The chemist resumed. Well, the valley looked all right then. Just a gray waste, probably full of crawlers like the others. We circled back over the city. Say, I want to tell you that the place was, well, gigantic. It was colossal. At first, I thought the size was due to that illusion I spoke of. You know, the nearness of the horizon, but it wasn't that. We sailed right over it, and you've never seen anything like it. But the sun dropped out of sight right then. I knew we were pretty far south, latitude 60, but I didn't know just how much night we'd have.